4:47 a.m., January 9, 2026. Sabine Neches Waterway, Port Arthur, Texas. A harbor pilot boat cut through dark water toward the outer anchorage zone. Temperature, 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Visibility, 2 nautical miles. Wind from the northwest at 12 knots, pushing a light chop against the hull. Elena Voss sat in the forward compartment, reviewing the approach chart for the MT Halcyon Star, a Liberia-flagged crude carrier at Anchor 3, 0.2 miles offshore shore, waiting on a morning tide window for a berth at Marathon's Beaumont terminal. She had made this run 600 times. Same waterway. Same deep-water channel markers threading through the Neches River estuary. Same routine. She stepped aboard the Halcyon Star at 4:52 a.m. via the pilot ladder on the port quarter. The first officer greeted her at the bridge access without making eye contact. Then she looked at the navigation display. The ship's computer showed a preset approach line 1.3 degrees off the published deepwater channel. 1.3 degrees sounds like measurement error. On a 312-meter tanker drawing 20 meters of water in a channel with documented shoaling on both shoulders, it is not measurement error. It is the difference between a routine approach and a grounding incident that closes the Neches River to traffic for 72 hours. No licensed master who had ever called at this port would preload that heading. Retention, Cont 30 hook resolution Ts. Voss corrected the line without comment. She completed the berthing approach without incident. She said nothing on the bridge, returned to the pilot station, and logged the deviation in her standard post-shift report. She filed a routine pilot competency concern form, the kind of paperwork that generates a single email, gets routed to a Coast Guard sector inbox, and typically disappears into administrative processing within 48 hours. This one did not disappear, because the name Halcyon Star appeared that same afternoon on a list that a Coast Guard intelligence analyst had been maintaining quietly for 7 months, vessels with documented transponder gaps in the Gulf of Oman tracking corridor. One harbor pilot's navigation observation, 1.3 degrees, logged in a form nobody was supposed to act on, had connected to a federal investigation spanning 5 years, 3 continents, and $1.4 billion in evaded sanctions. What happened next took 4 months to unfold. What it unraveled had been running since October 2020. Elena Voss didn't draw institutional attention. She was 44 years old, born in Port Arthur, daughter of a Neches River tugboat captain who worked the same waterway for 31 years. She earned her Coast Guard unlimited tonnage license at 27. She joined the Sabine Neches Pilots Association at 31. By 2026, she held a 17-year record with no incidents, no disciplinary actions, no complaints from vessel operators, no insurance claims. Oil company operations managers had a phrase for pilots at her level, name requested. When Marathon or ExxonMobil scheduled a challenging approach, a deep draft vessel in marginal weather, a late tide berth during a maintenance window on the fairway, they asked for her specifically. She had guided vessels drawing 19 meters through the Neches at low water periods when most pilots would have delayed until the next tide. She had berthed a 165,000-ton VLCC at the ExxonMobil terminal in 30-knot crosswind conditions with a 3-hour lead time. Her schedule was fixed. Wednesday, Friday nights. She drove a gray pickup truck to the pilot station, wore the same waterproof shell jacket she had owned for 6 years, and kept a thermos of coffee on the bridge consoles during every approach. After shifts, she drove 12 minutes home to a canal property in Groves, Texas. She was by every measure a technical professional with a specialized job. Move tankers through a federal waterway, file paperwork, go home. She had no relationship with the Coast Guard beyond the standard certification and inspection cycle. No federal law enforcement contacts. No informant arrangement. No awareness of any ongoing sanctions investigation. She noticed what she noticed because she was exceptionally good at her job. That turned out to be sufficient. To understand what Voss had connected to, you have to go back to October 2020. The Iran sanctions framework, restrictions on Iranian crude exports, refined products, and financial instruments, had been in formal operation since 2012 in various configurations. By 2020, enforcement was operating at unprecedented levels. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control was running an average of 12 vessel and entity designations per quarter. CENTCOM maintained active naval interdiction patrols through the Strait of Hormuz. Coalition maritime surveillance covered the primary transit corridors from the Iranian terminal at Karg Island to the strait approaches. Operation Blackline was designed by people who had studied that enforcement architecture in detail and identified where its gaps were. The structure had 3 distinct layers. Layer 1 was origin laundering. Iranian light sour crude, loaded at Karg Island Terminal, was transferred onto vessels that immediately went dark, transponders disabled, automatic identification system data suspended. These vessels transited north into the central Gulf of Oman and conducted ship-to-ship transfers with a rotating fleet of Liberia-flagged and Panama-flagged intermediate carriers. The transfers took place outside monitored shipping lanes, in 12-hour windows timed against known satellite coverage patterns over the region. The intermediate carrier then reactivated its transponder on a course consistent with departure from the Omani port of Mina al-Fahal, carrying freshly issued certificates of origin from a Muscat-based trading company called Gulf Maritime Resources LLC. Layer 2 was documentation. Gulf Maritime Resources LLC was not a shell company. It was a real Omani petroleum trading firm, registered since 2014 with genuine clients and real transactions. Somewhere between 2018 and 2020, its documentation infrastructure was compromised by individuals who have not been publicly identified as of June 2026. The firm's legitimate operations continued uninterrupted. Its owners had no idea that false certificates were being issued under their company's name and seal. Gulf Maritime Resources was a victim of the scheme, used as cover without consent. Layer 3 was the receiving end. 3 independent petroleum brokers operating out of Houston, Beaumont, and Lake Charles had set up an arrangement with procurement contacts at Marathon's Beaumont refinery to accept Liberian-flagged cargoes under Omani documentation without the standard third-party verification procedures that would have flagged the origin discrepancy. A Marathon petroleum procurement officer identified in the sealed indictment as Marcus D. Keller, age 51, of Sugar Land, Texas, had approved documentation waivers for 6 Liberian-flagged cargo arrivals over 3 years, each citing third-party broker attestation from one of the 3 broker firms that was itself part of the network. 2 shipping insurance underwriters, one based in Houston, one in London, issued coverage for the network's vessels while bypassing the origin verification requirements that their own policy terms mandated. Retention point. 4 stakes bend. The economic logic was straightforward. Iranian crude, under sanction, moved at a discount of $22 to $28 per barrel compared to equivalent Omani grades. Over 5 years, the network moved approximately 240,000 barrels per month through Beaumont, a volume small enough to avoid statistical pattern detection against a major refinery's normal throughput, accumulating an estimated $1.4 billion in value from the undersold spread and falsified documentation margin. Port fees falsified over the same period represented an additional estimated $87 million in underpaid charges. The scheme survived CENTCOM's heightened Strait of Hormuz focus in early 2025, when fastboat interdiction activity near the maritime boundary commanded naval attention by rerouting volume. During the 7 months when Hormuz enforcement was most intense, tanker traffic through Beaumont through this network actually increased. The product kept moving. The money kept clearing. And nothing at the port level generated a single flag. Until January 2026. The Coast Guard Sector Houston-Galveston received Elena Voss's Pilot Competencies Concern form on January 9th at 6:22 a.m., approximately 90 minutes after the Halcyon Star completed its berth approach at Marathon's Beaumont terminal. Standard procedure. The form is processed by a sector operations specialist, logged in the Maritime Incident Reporting Database, forwarded to District 8 Waterways Management for review. Estimated turnaround, 48 to 72 hours. At 11:14 a.m., something different happened. The National Maritime Intelligence Integration Office maintained a daily automated batch comparison between newly logged vessel names and its active anomaly list for the Gulf of Oman corridor. The Halcyon Star's name appeared in the Voss incident log. It matched an entry dated June 23, 2025. 6 months earlier, a Lloyd's Market Association intelligence report had flagged the Halcyon Star for a transponder gap of 11 hours and 42 minutes in the Gulf of Oman. The gap occurred in a location consistent with a documented ship-to-ship transfer zone. Stated cargo on that voyage, crude oil of Omani origin. The Lloyd's report had been shared with Treasury's OFAC monitoring desk. It had not triggered an active investigation. The automated name match generated an escalation flag in the MI system. By 2 p.m., the Halcyon Star's full documentation package, manifest, bill of lading, certificate of origin, insurance certificates, was on the desk of a Coast Guard Investigative Service special agent assigned to District 8's Counter-Illicit Finance Task Force. He spent 3 hours with the documents. One detail stopped him. The certificate of origin listed Gulf Maritime Resources LLC as cargo originator and Mina Al Fahal, Oman as the load port. But the cargo specification showed a light sour grade at 3.4% sulfur content. That specification doesn't match standard Omani production. Oman's primary crude grades are medium sour. Light sour crude at 3.4% is consistent with Karg Island Iranian production. Taken alone, a grade mismatch can be explained. Blending third-party spot trades, legitimate grade variations. But combined with the Lloyd's transponder gap, the Halcyon Star's documentation now carried 2 independent anomalies. Voss's pilot report, a name, requested professional, noting a master who seemed unfamiliar with a port he claimed to have called on before, added a third. A master unfamiliar with the Beaumont Channel approach had either never previously called on this port under his own name, or the crew had been rotated deliberately to prevent identification by experienced port personnel who would have remembered a familiar face. The CGS agent requested a 30-day surveillance authorization on the Halcyon Star's berthing activities and any subsequent calls. Approval came by 5 p.m. I've spent time going through the case record, and the thing that keeps pulling at me is what almost happened here. If the Halcyon Star had been under a different pilot on January 9th, if the competency concern form had gone to a different inbox, or if the In My Batch match had run a day later, while the vessel was already at sea, the 11:14 a.m. flag never fires. The case file never opens. The investigation doesn't start. What followed was methodical. 4 months of work that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. The Halcyon Star departed Marathon's Beaumont terminal on January 13th. A CGS agent photographed the crew manifest as it was filed with Customs and Border Protection. 11 active crew members. Mixed nationalities. Captain listed as Andrei Petrova, Latvian national, master's license issued through the Liberian registry. The license was legitimate. Petrova had held it for 9 years. But no prior Beaumont calls appeared for him in any U.S. port record system. The Sabine Netches Pilots Association confirmed he had never appeared in their records as master of any vessel on this waterway. NCIS became formally involved on January 22nd when Treasury's OFAC desk referred the Halcyon Star file to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service based on the Iran-linked vessel list connection. IRS Criminal Investigation joined the joint team on February 3rd. What IRS CI brought was authority the other agencies couldn't match. Subpoena power over domestic banking records, grand jury process in the Eastern District of Texas, and direct relationships with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network's Analytical Division. The money trail opened at Gulf Maritime Resources LLC. FinCEN data showed a U.S. dollar correspondent account linked to the Muscat Company had processed wire transfers totaling $43.6 million over the prior 18 months. The account was held at a Bahraini institution. The dollar clearing leg ran through a New York correspondent bank, standard for international commodity transactions. What was not standard was the beneficiary structure. Funds exiting Gulf Maritime Resources did not go to crude suppliers, shipping operators, or port agents. They went to 3 shell companies, one in the Marshall Islands, one in the British Virgin Islands, one in Delaware. The Delaware company was incorporated in 2021. Its registered agent was a Wilmington law firm. Its sole beneficial owner, identified through a combination of FinCEN Section 314 BOP requests and a federal grand jury subpoena, was a Houston petroleum trading firm, Coastal Meridian Trading Corp. Coastal Meridian was one of the three brokers at the network's core. Retention comp point, 50% mid-roll hook. Here's what matters about the financial architecture and why the scheme survived 5 years. The money didn't hide. Every transaction cleared through legitimate correspondent banking. Every wire was documented in standard SWIFT messaging. The operation survived not because the flows were invisible, but because no single financial institution had visibility across all three shell layers simultaneously. FinCEN could see the Bahraini account. The New York correspondent bank could see the clearing leg. The Wilmington law firm could see the Delaware company. But none of them had the full picture until IRSCI assembled it in February 2026. This is what financial architecture means in modern sanctions evasion. You don't hide the money. You distribute it across enough jurisdictions that the pattern vanishes unless someone assembles the fragments, and that assembly requires either a triggering event or sustained analytical work that no single agency runs on every suspicious vessel. Elena Voss provided the triggering event. By the first week of March 2026, the team had confirmed not one broker firm but three. Coastal Meridian Trading Corp., Houston. Its principal, David Hargrove, age 53, Harvard Business School, no prior criminal record. His brokerage had been placing crude supply arrangements between the Halcyon Star, at least two other Liberian-flagged vessels, and the Marathon Terminal since 2021. He drove a black Mercedes G-Wagon and maintained a vacation property in the Florida Keys. Gulf Commodities Advisors LLC, Lake Charles, Louisiana, managing partner James Elwes, age 47, formerly a petroleum supply analyst at Shell's downstream division. He had resigned from Shell in 2019 under circumstances the company declined to discuss publicly. Elwes' firm had handled documentation processing for 3 of the 7 network vessels, acting as an intermediary layer between the ship agents and the refinery procurement desk. Meridian Shore Partners, Beaumont, Texas, a single-employee firm. Its owner, Patricia Simmons, age 58, had spent 22 years as a logistics coordinator at Marathon's Beaumont facility before taking early retirement in 2018. She knew the terminal's berth scheduling system, its procurement approval cycle, and the documentation format that Marathon's compliance desk would accept without additional verification. She was, from the network's perspective, an installation of institutional knowledge. Marcus D. Keller inside Marathon's procurement division had approved documentation waivers for 6 Liberian-flagged cargo arrivals over 3 years. Each approval cited third-party broker attestation, provided in each case by one of the 3 firms that were themselves part of the scheme. 2 shipping insurance underwriters had issued coverage without conducting the origin verification their own policies required. The London underwriter's documentation gap was identified in late February through a parallel inquiry with the United Kingdom's National Crime Agency, brought in via Malat. The scope expanded with every passing week of investigation. What had appeared in January as one suspicious vessel had become, by March, a network spanning 7 vessels, 3 broker firms, 2 insurance underwriters, 1 refinery insider, 1 compromised Omani documentation source, and 5 years of financial flows through 7 jurisdictions. What this case tells us about the current sanctions enforcement architecture is worth saying directly. The failure here was not a failure of technology or intelligence capability. Every institution involved had some piece of the picture. OFAC had the Lloyd's transponder report. FinCEN had the wire transfer patterns. The Pilots Association had Voss's competency concern. The problem was institutional fragmentation, a structural condition that isn't fixed by adding more capability to any single agency. The condition persists. The next scheme will find the same gaps. By the first week of April 2026, the Joint Task Force had assembled enough documentary and financial evidence to convene a federal grand jury in the Eastern District of Texas. It was convened on April 11th. then the first serious operational problem appeared. A second network vessel, the MT Halcyon Trader, a Liberia-flagged crude carrier documented as a sister ship to the Halcyon Star under common, beneficial ownership, was scheduled to arrive at Marathon's Beaumont terminal on April 18th. If the vessel arrived and completed cargo discharge, the crude would be processed and destroyed. If the vessel was turned away prematurely or flagged at the port entry checkpoint, the network would detect the operational change and go dark within hours. All 5 domestic targets would receive warning before the arrest team was in position. The task force had 7 days to unseal a partial indictment, execute domestic arrests, and board the Halcyon Trader at anchor or let the vessel berth normally and race the clock. They chose to let the vessel berth. Grand jury sessions ran on 3 consecutive days. Document subpoenas were drafted, filed, and returned through a 24-hour cooperative cycle with the presiding federal judge, who had placed all proceedings under seal. OFAC designation packages for 5 vessels were being simultaneously prepared at Treasury. The Halcyon Trader berthed on April 18th, offloaded on April 19th and 20th, departed without incident on April 21st. On April 22nd, a sealed indictment was returned against Hargrove, Elwes, Simmons, Keller, and 2 unnamed foreign national co-conspirators. Court records describe the matter only as a commercial enforcement action in the Eastern District of Texas. The network did not know the indictment existed. The second operational problem appeared on May 22nd. Finson flagged an anomalous wire transfer, $240,000 U.S. sourced, routed through the Bahraini correspondent account to a personal bank account at a Cyprus institution. The recipient had no prior financial relationship with any entity in the network's documented structure. The transfer had occurred 6 days before the Halcyon Star's estimated Sabine Pass arrival window. Someone was moving money. Whether it was routine or a signal that someone inside the network knew about the investigation was impossible to determine. But the task force couldn't treat an unexplained transfer to an isolated Cyprus account 6 days before the planned arrest as coincidence. The domestic arrest timeline was moved forward by 48 hours. Would you have made that call, accelerating an operation by 48 hours based on one unexplained wire transfer, knowing that if the transfer was routine, you've gained nothing, and if it wasn't, 48 hours may not be enough? That question doesn't have a clean answer. Law enforcement operations involve judgment calls under incomplete information, and the ones that work tend to look, in retrospect, like obvious decisions. The ones that don't look like catastrophic miscalculations. The difference is often timing. The decision on where to board the Halcyon Star had already produced disagreement within the team. NCIS favored a high seas interdiction under the Proliferation Security Initiative framework, which allows signatory nations to board vessels suspected of sanctions-related cargo violations. The argument: certainty. Stop the vessel at sea, preserve evidence, eliminate the risk of a warning reaching the ship before boarding. CGS and IRSCI favored waiting for U.S. anchorage. A high seas boarding produces a maritime seizure under Admiralty jurisdiction with evidence standards that differ from federal district court criminal procedure. Chain of custody documentation for currency, records, and electronic media recovered under domestic jurisdiction is cleaner and more defensible in prosecution. The criminal case, not just the vessel seizure, required the domestic anchorage boarding. The U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District made the call on May 15th. Wait for anchorage. Accept the risk of a warning reaching the ship in exchange for prosecutorial integrity of the evidence record. That trade-off was real, and not everyone in the task force was comfortable with it. Here's our take. The high seas option was sacrificed for procedural rigor, and the procedural argument is legitimate, but the risk it accepted was also legitimate. If Petrova received warning and ordered the forward hull cavity opened and the currency dumped overboard, the case loses $34 million in physical evidence. The indictment survives, but the forfeiture collapses. It's a defensible call. It's also a call that required the Halcyon Star not to have already been warned. If you've been in a situation where you had to choose between speed and precision under real stakes, where both mattered, and you couldn't have both, Comment below. We read them all. MAR Microfinal, 14-minute mark. The sealed documents were held. 5 domestic arrest teams positioned. The Halcyon Star tracked via commercial satellite imaging. Its documented history of AIS gaps made transponder data unreliable, transiting the eastern Atlantic on an inbound course consistent with the Sabine Pass approach. Estimated arrival, May 26 to 29. On May 27th, commercial satellite imagery placed the Halcyon Star approximately 240 nautical miles offshore, course consistent with arrival at Sabine Pass the following morning. Task Force Command issued the Operations Go authorization at 11 p.m. on May 27th. At 1:58 a.m. on May 28th, 2 Coast Guard MSST vessels departed Port Arthur Station. The Halcyon Star was confirmed at anchor in the outer anchorage zone at 2:12 a.m., positioned 4.1 miles offshore the Bolivar Road sea buoy, showing proper anchor lights. No crew visible on deck from the approach bearing. At 2:17 a.m., the MSST boats were underway. The lead boarding officer carried 3 documents: a federal boarding authorization signed by the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Texas, a federal arrest warrant for Captain Petrova, and a civil forfeiture seizure order covering the vessel, all currency, all documentation, and all electronic media aboard. NCIS special agents were embedded in both boarding teams. An IRS-CI agent was on the second boat, assigned to evidence documentation and chain of custody execution. At 2:22 a.m., the first MSST vessel came alongside the Halcyon Star's port quarter, the same access ladder Elena Voss had used 4 months and 13 days earlier. Boarding notification was transmitted over VHF Channel 16. No acknowledgement from the vessel. A second transmission, no response. At 2:27 a.m., the boarding team went up the ladder. Captain Petrova was on the bridge when they arrived. He was fully dressed. His jacket was on. He had not been asleep. The NCIS agent who led the bridge team later noted in his report that a satellite phone on the chart table was showing an active connected call when the team entered. The call was terminated within seconds of visual contact. The phone was evidence-bagged within 45 seconds of entry. The vessel was secured in 11 minutes. 11 crew members were mustered on the main deck, all detained under the federal warrant. No resistance. 1 crew member, a cook, had to be assisted to the assembly point because he was in the galley and unaware of the operation until directed by a boarding team member. The physical search began at 2:38 a.m. in the forward cargo area, accessible through a maintenance hatch that did not appear on the vessel's original class registry deck plan. The NCIS evidence team located a compartment constructed behind the forward collision bulkhead. The compartment was approximately 2 meters wide, 1.4 meters deep, 1.2 meters high. The access was sealed from the exterior by welded plate, a modification made after the vessel's original construction, using materials and weld technique that matched no documented maintenance record in the ship's certification file. Inside, $34 million in United States currency, vacuum sealed in clear plastic, bundled in mixed denominations. $100 bills represented the majority of the volume. The physical packaging was consistent with long-term storage, not operational float. This would be one of the largest cash seizures from a maritime boarding in Gulf Coast federal enforcement history outside of drug trafficking cases. The vessel's navigation and communications server was imaged in place by a Coast Guard digital forensics technician. Within 48 hours, analysts had recovered deleted voyage logs from 6 prior Beaumont calls, including the periods of Gulf of Oman transponder gap activity. The recovered logs contained ship-to-ship transfer coordinates, dates, cargo quantities, and contact frequencies for at least 4 prior Iranian crude transfer events, each correlated against the deleted AIS records from the corresponding Lloyd's flagged gaps. There's a detail in the forensic recovery that I keep coming back to. The voyage logs weren't just deleted. They were overwritten, a deliberate anti-forensics step that requires specific operational knowledge. Someone aboard the Halcyon Star had been coached on digital evidence elimination. The overwrite procedure was incomplete, which is why recovery was possible. But the attempt indicates a level of procedural sophistication that goes beyond a vessel crew acting on instinct. The network had a standard operating procedure for log destruction. It failed because the overwrite wasn't run to completion. At 2:17 a.m., simultaneous with the departure of the Misted boats from Port Arthur, FBI special agents in Houston, Beaumont, and Lake Charles had taken positions on their respective target locations. At 2:22 a.m., the moment the first Coast Guard vessel came alongside the Halcyon Star, arrest teams in all three cities executed. Simultaneously, David Hargrove, the Houston broker, was arrested at his residence in the Memorial neighborhood. He was asleep. He answered the door and was in handcuffs within 40 seconds. His home office contained a 4-drawer filing cabinet with physical copies of cargo documentation for 11 separate Halcyon Star and Alcyon trader shipments, organized chronologically. Each document set included a margin annotation in blue ink noting the spread between the Iranian spot price on the cargo date and the Omani documentation price. Handwritten, in ink, in a filing cabinet in his study. James Elwes, the Lake Charles broker, was arrested at his apartment near the lake. He did not answer the door. Agents entered under the warrant and found him in the kitchen, cell phone to his ear. His call log showed 3 outgoing calls placed in the prior 22 minutes. None had been answered. One of the numbers was later identified as belonging to Patricia Simmons. Patricia Simmons was not at her Beaumont address. She was located at a 24-hour Walmart 2 miles from her residence, in the parking lot, sitting in her car with the engine running. 2 duffel bags were in the back seat. The bags contained $286,000 in U.S. currency, 2 prepaid burner phones, and a set of identity documents in a name that returned no match in any federal database. Her arrest was at 2:31 a.m. She said nothing when agents approached her vehicle. Marcus Keller, the Marathon procurement officer, was arrested at his Sugar Land home at 2:22 a.m. He had been awake. His wife later told agents he had received a phone call at 1:30 a.m. and had not returned to bed. The 5th domestic target, the Houston-based insurance underwriter, surrendered voluntarily at the FBI's Houston field office at 6:45 a.m., accompanied by his attorney, who had apparently been retained the previous evening. The network had been taken down in a single 4-hour window. Microfinal, 21-minute mark. Within 72 hours of the May 28th operation, Treasury's OFAC formally designated 5 vessels, the Halcyon Star, the Alcyon Trader, and 3 others reconstructed as network participants from the voyage logs as blocked property under the Iran sanctions program. The designations froze any existing U.S. assets associated with those vessels and prohibited any U.S. person from further transactions with their operators or beneficial owners. Marathon Petroleum issued a statement acknowledging that 1 employee had been arrested in connection with a federal investigation and that the company was fully cooperating with federal authorities. Keller was not named publicly in the statement. The company noted that its compliance procedures were under review. The London-based insurance underwriters' documentation gaps were referred to the United Kingdom's Financial Conduct Authority. The FCA opened a parallel inquiry into the coverage practices of the firm in the first week of June 2026. The legitimate owners of Gulf Maritime Resources, LLC, the Muscat Trading Company, whose documentation infrastructure had been compromised without their knowledge, were formally notified of the fraud through Omani law enforcement authorities acting on a mutual legal assistance request in early June. Their cooperation with investigators is ongoing. The individuals who infiltrated the company's certificate-issuing process and produced the false origin documentation have not been publicly identified. The sealed indictment, covering Hargrove, Elwes, Simmons, Keller, and 2 foreign national co-conspirators, was unsealed on June 7, 2026. 212 pages. Charged offenses included violations of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and making false statements to federal customs authorities. Sentencing guidelines for the combination of charges faced by the primary defendants range from 12 to 22 years. None of the 5 defendants had entered a plea as of the current date. The Halcyon Star remains under federal seizure at anchor. The $34 million in recovered currency is in federal custody pending forfeiture proceedings. One loose end, and it matters. The May 22nd wire transfer, $240,000 routed to the Cyprus personal account, has not been traced to a final recipient. The Cyprus bank was served with a formal MLAT request in late May. Compliance is pending. Whether the transfer represented operational movement of funds, a payment to someone with advanced knowledge of the investigation's existence, or a routine transaction with unfortunate timing remains undetermined. The two foreign national co-conspirators identified in the sealed indictment have not been located. One is believed to be connected to the Muscat documentation infrastructure that compromised Gulf maritime resources. One is believed to be the financial intermediary who operated the Bahraini correspondent account. No extradition request, if one has been filed, is part of any publicly available court record. The Halcyon Trader, the second network vessel that berthed in Beaumont in April, is currently at sea. OFAC designation prevents it from calling at any U.S. port. It has not appeared in AIS tracking since June 1, 2026. Retention count point. Last 60s payoff plus open loop. And Elena Voss? The sealed indictment refers to an unnamed maritime professional whose observation precipitated the initial inquiry. Only 3 agents at the District 8 task force level knew her identity at the time of the unsealing. She has not been publicly identified in connection with the case. She has continued her Wednesday-Friday night rotation at the Sabine Netches Pilots Association. She guides tankers into Beaumont. She keeps her thermos of coffee on the bridge. She files her pilot reports. Will the 2 unidentified co-conspirators be located? Comment yes or no, and if you've seen anything connected to this network in the maritime or commodity space, we read every comment. The network is dismantled. The documentation infrastructure that built it, shell companies registered across 4 jurisdictions, correspondent banking opacity, origin certificate gaps in Omani trade registration is structurally unchanged. The demand for sanctioned crude at below market prices is unchanged. The margin that made $1.4 billion possible in 5 years has not been reduced by the arrest of 5 people in Texas. The scheme is over. The conditions that produced it are not.